Hello, I'm Jim Schaefer, host and executive producer of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Sharon E. Davis, who will discuss her book, Racial Healing, A Safe Place to Talk About Race. Welcome to Rip Rap, Sharon.
Thank you so much for having me.
I've found this a really fascinating book, particularly in terms of the circumstances going on around the country now with massive protests, people really upset over black men being shot, unarmed black men being shot by police, and then the criminal justice system not doing anything about it. So this idea of looking at racial healing, I think, is really an appropriate thing to do.
Well, I tell you, this particular topic isn't really new. It just hasn't hit the radar screen as much as I think that it should. Because racial healing really started around in the mid-'80s, 1980s. And I was fortunate enough to participate with a group of 9 people from diverse cultures and so-called races to really create the first institute for the healing of racism. And so the foundation of racial healing and this particular work has more to do with how do we get ourselves out of this ditch, figuring out ways that we can really help one another do it. So racial healing is over 20 some odd years old, actually, and more there seems to be an awakening about figuring out where we can actually talk about race anymore. I listened to a program, I think it was like an old Dick Cavett show once, and they were talking very openly about things that no one would say today as it relates to race. And so this ability or lack of ability for us to really dialogue means to me that we can't learn. And if we can't learn, then we can't heal. And if we can't heal, then things are going to remain the same or get worse.
But we need to be talking with individual people and not generalizing. And that's something that's kind of a thread throughout this book, that people look at others that they regard as a different race and then discover when you talk with them that there's additional details that allow you to understand what's going on. And instead of the fear and rage, all these really negative emotions, it helps to have that dialogic interaction.
Well, you've hit on a very important word, and that word is the emotions, because this is about emotions. There was a time when race and racism was more about equality under the law. So the emphasis was on the legal system and being colorblind under the law, and therefore justice would prevail when justice is colorblind. Well, that worked very well for the 1960s and the movement of the 60s and that, because the emphasis was literally the Constitution and the law. However, today we really can't write any more laws on this subject. Not possible. We can tweak a few of them, maybe, but we can't write any more new laws on this, and still this problem persists and almost prevails. So then the question becomes, what is the foundation for racial healing? How does this happen to be a phrase that gets to be important to us today as opposed to the 60s and equality? Well, the shift is really from equality to equity, which means to repair. So once we finished, so-called finished, with the 1960s for equality under the law, that really puts us right on the next course, which is equity, how to repair and recover. So racial healing is very, very important for us as individuals because we don't know, literally what we don't know. Most of us have never even been trained to know what we don't know, and the emotional content of this can be very high, and the penalties related to race can be astronomical if someone makes a mistake. And so racial healing is about providing that space where we can learn even when we make mistakes, which is crucial. And these emotions that we have about it, all of us, because the foundation of racial healing and equity has to do with every single culture and so-called race of people that have different histories, different experiences, being able to really exercise those emotions that are within us and also understand the misinformation that gets seated very deep within us. So this is about the emotions, more so than the, I'll call it the IQ. This is more about the EQ as opposed to anything else.
Well, how did you get into this?
You know, I get asked that question a lot because you may know that my previous career was IT. And so I get asked the question, how did you move from IT, because I was in it for quite a few years, and I loved IT, I really did. I got tired of it after a while, but I did really like it a lot. Well, the connection that I see with this is twofold. On a very personal level, I lived in Houston, Texas for a while, and I could not understand why my daughter at that time was being treated so differently. I did not know that Houston, Texas was really part of the South. I thought it was the Southwest. I'm a Midwesterner, probably had never been to Houston or to Texas at all before, so I thought it was the Southwest, but it really is part of the Old South, the disenfranchised European Americans. Those are my words. I know a lot of white people don't like to hear European Americans, but anyway, European Americans who were disenfranchised out of the South fled to eastern Texas. So there's a lot of remnants in Texas because of the Civil War in that regard. So it got really personal. How could this happen to, who would not like my baby? Who would not like, she's a wonderful little girl, literally. And then the other part of it is that on a global level, you know, doing technology is not much different than racial healing. Because just like technology has an architecture to it, so does racism and racial healing. There's an architecture as to how we got into this ditch, and there's an architecture for us as human beings, which we do have the capacity to dig ourselves out of this ditch. So they're very similar in that regard. So I look at it as really great change, great massive change to large numbers of people that are almost just as afraid of racial healing as in the early days were afraid of computers or not wanting to talk to a machine. It was emotional.
Of the great unknown.
Yeah.
I've heard definitions of racism as an issue of those who can hand out the benefits and those who can't get the benefits. Mm-hmm. And it's an interesting, you know, economic way of looking at it that a lot of people don't quite understand or maybe even agree with. But there is that pattern with that. But I still wonder, what do you think of what's going on with these protests? Why did this seem to be widespread? It started out just kind of local, and now it's gone national.
I don't have anything to back up what I'm about to say. It's my opinion, and it doesn't have research behind it. But actually, I'm pretty good at looking at patterns because of the IT thing is what I think it is. There's two very critical things that have happened most recently that would lend to this kind of activity. Just like in the 1960s, the laws weren't really passed until children started being murdered. When children started being murdered, then the nation said, oh, that's our bottom line. Bombings of little girls in churches, we can't go past that because that was the floor of what would be considered even minimally acceptable as it relates to the law of the land. So now we fast forward at this particular stage and we see once again the murdering of children and the uproar and the need to want to express why this is and no, this can't happen. This just can't happen. That's not the people that we are. So that's one of the elements that I think is pretty darn important. The other that led to this, I feel, has to do with the idea of the 1%, that there are now a number of European Americans, white Americans, who understand that not everybody is middle class, even if you're white.
It certainly has been disturbing, though, and it seemed like a tipping point. It seemed like one of those points where that was it. People simply couldn't take it anymore, and as they've started taking a look at this, then there's a pattern of more and more of these starting to come out, to just brutal murder and then no consequences. I mean, and very young kids are like the one that had the pellet gun and got shot within 2 seconds of the time the police officer pulled up. And I wonder, what on earth? What would be a way to use racial healing in these kinds of situations?
There's really several different ways that racial healing is important. First, it gets at, once again, that emotional content. There's such a thing that's really more developed now called unaware unconscious bias that every one of us have. And I really want to also mention that every single race and culture has work to do. There's no one that's exempt. There's no Dr. Martin Luther King that's going to appear, or some sort of space alien that will unite us. That just is fiction and fantasy, if you ask me. So these days, racial healing and the emotional content of how to stop some of this has to do with getting in touch with what we have been taught at a very young age. And we have a lot of misinformation. I've been doing this for over 25 years myself. And I tell you, every week that I do that show, I learn something new, because it is that big and that wide, but there is a pattern to it as well. So getting in touch with our unconscious bias, and if you'd like, I'll give you an example of my own.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in technology, I used to run a couple of departments, and one of the departments that I ran was a center for new products. So we test them out on human beings, because they didn't really know what this thing was, but they were, like you said, afraid of it. And so in this regard, I had a variety of people that was on one of my teams, and one was an Asian American woman. And she had some quirks. That's okay. There are a lot of quirky people in IT at that time, and I'll vote myself in as one of those quirky people too. But I couldn't understand why I had an emotional reaction to her. And I thought about it. I'm like, what is it? What is it? And because we had just gotten finished with developing and exercising some of the things in racial healing, I found out exactly what that was. And here's what it was. My father was a Tuskegee Airman, and he didn't, like most men of that era, talk about the war at all. It just didn't. One time when I was very young, probably only happened once, I overheard him say something about Asian Americans, how they tried to kill him. And at a very young age, because I am my father's daughter, I love my dad. Yeah, he's a very active, engaged father with his children. And so that stuck with me, but I had no idea that that's where that came from until I was able to take a look at my belief system and my unaware biases that I had. So to get back to your other question about the definition of race and racism, racism isn't any more alone about privilege than anything else, because all of us are members of the same human family. We're part of the same species. So in that regard, there are individuals who could be African American, Asian, doesn't matter what their culture is, that have the power to discriminate or destroy the lives of someone else. So I know that there's an emphasis on this idea that basically white people are the ones who perpetuate this. Well, I think that this book and racial healing has another point of view, because most white people don't think about race on a daily basis. Don't get up in the morning thinking about race or what's going to happen to me when I walk out my door. That's just not a part of the white mindset, and that's what privilege does to anyone, whether they're white or whoever they might be. So an individual in our country or in different parts of the world isn't individually responsible for racism. Are there some white advantages? Yes. But just like anybody else, if we have an advantage about something, we are really unaware that that's an advantage, because advantage feels good and we don't really talk about it or even think about it that much. We just like to enjoy it. I can also say that in terms of this definition, that when I say that there are a number of races and cultures that have work to do, you'll notice that one chapter in the book deals with what's called internalized racism, what people of color must do, and how that works. And the same with the white advantage or the privilege of being born into stories that a white person or a person of color, these are bad terms. We don't have a good common language because white people aren't white. That's another story. Anyway, that we have to really understand that the recovery of racism has to do with what we need to discover about ourselves first and our histories and what part we have played inadvertently or by design and how to fix that. And that's what racial healing does.
Well, I teach writing at the college level. And one of the things I try to do with my students is to have them use critical thinking and to write journals. And I think that's important to develop a reflective awareness, self-awareness of what you're doing and why you're doing it. And they come up with some amazing insights that they had never thought about. And I tell them that the moment is important for you to understand, and they generalize, But once they settle down in the moment and specific people, then they can see what actually is going on. And I think that's an important element, is to look at the specific person you're dealing with, not the stereotypes, not the generalities, but the specific person, see who they are.
I think you're absolutely right, and that's part of this getting personal, a part of racial healing. If it doesn't get to that personal level of wanting to know more about a member of our human family or our species, then we don't know the full story. It's like an illusion, or it's like not being in reality of the world in which we live. And so I think that's really a key part of racial healing experience, is to be able to be reflective, but not get so caught up in guilt and shame and anger and fear to the degree that no progress is made. Because that, I feel, is one of the big things that's happening in our country right now. You make a mistake, you lose your job. Many people do. Or you even blink on race, and somebody is really just on the person about that. So that's not going to help us in racial healing, and a safe place to talk about race helps build another doorway to learn and grow.
Another important concept, and I mentioned a little bit before, is using dialogue, because specifically dialogue is where you're listening to the other person, the other person's listening to you, and you might have a chance of exchanging meaning. But American conversations, as you well know, are monologic, people talking at each other, and research has shown there's never a gap of more than 20 seconds because Americans don't like silence. But that what I call dialogic interaction is what's crucial, so that you're slowing it down, listening carefully what the other person's saying, and not your own bias, what your own reaction is, but what are they actually saying.
That's very interesting because, part of this work also is doing classes and doing executive coaching with leaders and teams just on race. And one of the things that was very interesting to me about dialogue and dialogos and that was I had an opportunity to see where that comes from in our culture. And, being an ex-technologist, things make more sense to me when they're in squares and circles, and I can see the design of it a bit. And then when it started getting to the point of statements like, if it isn't written, it doesn't exist, as a, quintessential European way of thinking. So if it's not written somewhere, it can't be true. And so that deals a lot with not only ways of learning, but also another aspect of that seems to be in Western culture. You're the expert on this. I'm just sharing with you what I believe. It may not be true, and feel free to correct me. In Western European culture, it's really based on debate. Yes, no, either, or, and parsing. And the learning experience seems to come about that way more. So the person that asks more questions gets noticed more. The person who is a little more quiet may not get the attention because they're not considered very smart or whatever all of that might be. And so now we have this notion of dialogue, dialogos, which really gets us from the intellect more to the emotional aspect of what we're thinking and then what we're feeling and what we're doing. So that's the importance of it. Is debate wrong? No. We need debate for so many things. Not a problem with that. There are times, though, when it's not as helpful. So dialogue is more so intimate. The way that we would talk around a kitchen table with people who are friends. So we learn the secrets of one another's heart and can hold that dear and hold their interests dear. So here we have in our society, something that says, ask question, and it's parsing, either or, yes, no. And that's not going to get us where we need to go in racial healing. It just won't do that.
Something you might find interesting is that, based on my studies, that there's what they call Western rhetoric, which is the argumentation, and it's a power-based thing, based on empires, about, I have made this point, so I win, I have the most intelligent, wonderful thing. There's also Asian rhetoric that's around for more than twice as long, 5,000 years, and Western rhetoric 2,000. And that's always about the trusted authorities. And then I might be able to add something to this. It's not this aggressive, in your face, I have the most wonderful thing. And I found that really interesting, that, and also Western concepts are pretty binary, good, bad, visible, invisible, and ancient cultures know there's an in-between place, and many important things happen there that are not necessarily defined. So I just throw that out for you, but it's an interesting concept when you're quite right. What you're talking about is this whole issue of power. And the thing to do in dealing with people is take the power and set it aside and look at them as people. One of the threads through the book is your own development of how you worked on this, and you talked about the National Resource Center for the Healing of Racism and your involvement with W.K. Kellogg Foundation. Maybe we can talk about that, because this is a whole dimension to your struggle to work for healing.
Well, it's very interesting, and this is my story. Others may have other opinions about it. The work in Houston, Texas that we did in the mid-'80s found its way around this country in different parts of Canada and Great Britain, so I've been told. And because a journalist from CBS wrote a book, and that book spelled out basically what we were doing. And by the way, we didn't know what we were doing. It was trial and error, and we made a lot of errors. But in this process, that particular journalist came through Michigan and gave a couple of presentations in western Michigan, which got noticed. And so a whole series of events happened after that, and one was to create the National Resource Center for Racial Healing. And the National Resource Center for Racial Healing was expected to help launch and galvanize all of these, I'll call them, I think it was President Bush said, points of light. The elder, Bush would call them points of light as it relates to race and racial healing. So it got fairly far down the road, but it just takes a lot to do a National Resource Center, especially on this subject. So the short story after that was that the Kellogg Foundation ended up, through this means, and probably some others as well, to create America Healing. And the idea with that is very similar to this analogy. And you may know they were criticized for that, publicly criticized for this. And it's very similar to the notion that when people who are handicapped wanted berms that would make wheelchairs and all of that more accessible, there was a little bit of a flurry or fight about that. So what happened when that became law and sidewalks were accessible for the most disadvantaged at that point, everybody moved ahead. So fathers would stroll their babies around and use that kind of access, and pregnant women, all kinds of resources, all kinds of things happened so that people could use those resources. So now we fast forward, and we see that as it relates to race, the most vulnerable of people are usually the most impoverished as well in the cities, especially in the inner cities. So if we can fix that, everybody moves ahead. Everybody moves ahead. And it's not any different from affirmative action. And I don't think that most people understand or know that the biggest group of beneficiaries of affirmative action were white women. Good for white women. See, that's not a problem. Good for white women. Not a problem, because everybody moves ahead. So it's the same with this. And so I take my hat off to the Kellogg Foundation, because they stood tall. And I think there will be a lot of great impact for everybody.
Then you've also talked about your radio program. And how did you get into that?
Well, my background is not in radio, but I felt that we needed a way to reach the masses of people who aren't going to come to classes for whatever reason. Fear, whatever it is, doesn't matter. And really wanted to move this out of the realm of entertainment and debate to something that people could actually use and do something about, or hear something that was brand new to them or cause them to reflect and see what their role would be going forward. So we piloted this at the National Resource Center, and it worked really well. People liked it. And so you may know that the National Resource Center closed. We closed the National Resource Center. And so a business partner and I said, you know, this really worked. We just can't leave that setting like that. And that's when we launched a safe place to talk about race on Voice America online network. And from the people that we got to talk about this subject was phenomenal, just phenomenal, and the listeners as well.
Well, we all really ought to talk about some of those people because they're extraordinary. One of them was the skinhead.
Yeah.
That, you know, maybe you can talk a little bit about her because she didn't exactly fit in with my notion of what a skinhead is.
Well, you know, I've had a chance to interview Angela King 2 times. Once was with the National Resource Center radio show, and then this particular book. Her story, I don't feel, is that unusual. However, the most significant part of it is that here's a young woman who grew up in a household that definitely did not like people of color, and it was very clear. This is also a young woman who, when she was in middle school, I believe it was able to do things and submit papers that really were just really racist, and the teachers had no comment about it. As a matter of fact, I believe she says she got a B on it. And then when it's called to their attention, they said, okay, just cool it, basically, a little bit. So out of her experiences this way, you may also know that she was recruited by some skinheads, and she joined, and she went to prison. And in prison, and this was the key question that I had for her, was there something that happened to you in prison that made you a believer, and to stop this racist, leg and trend that you were on? And she says what she found out was that human beings are human beings. So she met other women, and this was a federal prison, by the way. She met other women who didn't, African American, or I think it was a Jamaican woman, who didn't like white people. And that was a revelation to her. It's things like that, those different experiences that way. And that's when she decided that she reevaluated what she thought she knew, which is a definite part of racial healing, is the reevaluation. So when she came out of prison, she had her undergraduate degree and then got her master's degree, and has been on a trail of life after hate ever since. And she's remarkable, just remarkable.
Well, thank you for being on Rip Rap.
Thank you for the invitation. I enjoyed it.